I think, Louisa, are you there? Oh yeah, you are.
Yes, I am. I'm here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it's been an interesting discuss so far. I'd like to thank the Minister for Finance and Human Resource Management for Tamil Nadu for just kickstarting the discussion, and also um, our last speaker, the former Finance Secretary. I think I can draw some parallels from some of the things that he raised there, relating to our situation here in Nigeria. Um, of course, every situation is a bit peculiar, but I want to say that generally, right now, governments around the world are facing similar challenges that have been precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, on one hand, we have the health crisis, and then it has dovetailed into an economic crisis. And this necessitates really the need for public sector institutions to be quite efficient because they're pivotal to all the decisions that will be made during this period and for service delivery and also in terms of policy. And for this reason, I think that this webinar on public administration in developing countries is quite timely. I mean, it may want to achieve several objectives, but just in light of the current issues with the pandemic, I think it's quite timely. Um, we all know, just like the minister just said, the importance of the public sector institutions, and he's given us how it has evolved over time in India. I'd like to say that developing countries, not just India, have continued to grapple with the problems of public sector inefficiencies, I mean, over decades and probably even more. I think one of the issues is that the size of civil service in these climes are typically bloated. And that's probably because the government is the employer of last resort. And so one of the issues you have is having strong and severe resistance from interest groups within the public sector. Also, the bureaucracy that was created, former finance secretary just talked about about 14 layers of approvals. The bureaucracy that has been created in the civil service has also, in some ways, become like a hindrance to its efficiency. Of course, there are other issues like the complex socio-political context that we have, in some countries, and typically it's unique to each country. However, we must recognize that the public sector institutions are still very, very important, and we need them to work efficiently because several poor people in our countries have to resort to the government. They put their trust in government to be able to alleviate their sufferings in terms of employment, in terms of social welfare and public services. Um, yeah, talking about if the trust is there now, social contracts, that would then be a different discussion. But going forward, we need public institutions to be quite prepared. I think that this pandemic that just happened probably revealed some of the challenges that we do have in our public sector institutions. I mean, from around here, I would say that not every public institution was quite prepared in terms of connectivity that we needed to sustain remote working during the lockdowns. So, I mean, everyone was locked down, but certain government services, are critical, needed to be provided still. I mean, just looking in terms of information on infection rates, on test results, and just the general coverage of the pandemic, that was a service to be provided by government. And I think going forward, digitization of government needs to take center stage, especially as the future of public sector work is changing. I mean, former finance secretary talked about the fact that things have evolved from 50 years ago or 100 years ago when these civil service institutions were set up. We're going to be having a lot of data sharing, a lot of virtual meetings and collaborations online for even public sector institutions. And there's a need for them to step up to the plate on this. Now, bringing it home closer to where I am here in Nigeria, we have had several reforms. This has not been new to Nigeria in terms of public sector institutional reforms over the decades, especially after the independence, the country has undergone several reforms for the civil service. I mean, we've had reforms in 1963, 1970, 1974, 1988, and then it goes on 2004, 2017, and even currently there are reforms going on. It appears that every government administration, comes up with some reforms for the civil service. And I think this is indicative of the fact that there are, issues that need to be resolved within the civil service. The reforms have covered a range of areas. We've had reforms address wages, salaries, and conditions of service of staff, staff capacity building in terms of meritocracy, training, manpower development. Reforms have also looked at organization restructuring and trying to just generally strengthen the institution, process optimization. Also, very key has been the professionalization of the public service, trying to address the attitude to work, culture change, patrimonial inclinations. Um, Another area has been performance management, which personally I've been involved in providing advice to the Office of the Head of the Civil Service of the Federation some years back, looking at how to design a more responsive performance management framework service-wide for the entire civil service. And yeah, a lot of work was done, but it didn't quite kickstart, because something of that magnitude, you can imagine some of the challenges that would be faced. Other areas where reforms have been undertaken in the Nigerian civil service include the modernization of the processes, that civil service processes. There have been attempts to use some more modern techniques, like you have infusing some new public management practices, project management, budgeting tools, results-based management, and several of them. I think specific to Nigeria, or perhaps India has something similar, was the infusion of the federal character principle. As some of you may know, Nigeria is a federation, so and it's it's a mix of different cultures and religions here in Nigeria. And so, uh, at some point, a federal character principle was introduced in the civil service to ensure equitable representation of people across the different geopolitical zones. Um, One of the areas too that has been, quite topical for reforms has been the proper sizing of the service and elimination of ghost workers. It will be interesting to know if this is a thing, an issue in India as well. Um, we've had one of the notable reports that we've had that had to do with the review of the civil service was the Orasaya report. And that report looked deeply at restructuring and rationalization of the parastatals and the commissions and the agencies in the civil service. Following that report, there was a white paper drafting committee that reviewed the report as well, agreed with some of its recommendations, and then discounted some. But basically, most of the recommendations, similar with what the finance secretary had talked about, had to do with scrapping some agencies, merging some agencies, deciding on some agencies that needed to be self-funded, and the likes of that. Well, needless to say, the recommendations are yet to be implemented till date. I think generally, just looking at these number of reforms we've had over time just reflects the fact that um, we identify the fact that we can improve things within the civil service, and this is pertinent. Um, just this month, the Federal Civil Service Strategy and Implementation Plan that would start from this year and run till 2025 was presented by the head of the civil service at a presidential level briefing. And even at this briefing, the vice president called for reform of the Nigerian civil service, with particular emphasis on the welfare of the staff of the civil service. I'd say that the results of the reforms have been mixed. There have been incremental improvements. Uh, for some, like in the areas of the verification of the personnel on payroll and digitization of just some processes. However, there's still more opportunities to improve in other areas. Beyond administration-led reforms in Nigeria, we've also had the support of private sector to help us improve the public sector. One of such partnerships has been the one between the Office of the Head of the Civil Service of the Federation and the African Initiative for Governance. And just recently, in April of this year, the African Initiative of Governance for Governance was able to present documented SOPs, standard operating procedures, for all 26 departments within the Office of the Head of the Civil Service of the Federation. And it's expected that this is one step, in the right direction to help the staff to perform their tasks more effectively and accurately. Also, the current reform is being led by steering and implementation committees that have memberships drawn from the private sector as well as the public sector, and also some input from development partners. Quite naturally, we have faced a number of challenges in terms of actually entrenching and deepening these reforms. And we are not yet where we desire to be. Some of these challenges really border around organizational resistance to change, being able to get the adequate data of high quality that can inform reforms. There are also some challenges in terms of funding of reforms and continuity of reforms. Sometimes when reforms are also being implemented, there are challenges in terms of change management, helping to actually hold the staff of the service, to handhold them through the process of change and also to get their buy-in really. I think for key imperatives going forward for successful and sustainable reforms in public sector in developing countries that have similar contexts with Nigeria, I think what will be key will be recognizing that successful reforms ride on the back of strong political will and commitment. I think that the finance secretary who spoke just before me emphasized this significantly. Reforms will not be possible without strong political will. Even if these reforms are externally initiated, it must receive buy-in and ownership by the government in place in order for them to succeed, really. Also, we must have at the back of our minds, especially for developing countries, that deepening these reforms is a fiscally expensive venture. And there's need for significant funding to be committed over a period of time. I think sometimes reforms are treated in a bit of a projectized manner for public sector institutions, but really it does take time. And so political will and stamina are absolutely essential. Additionally, one of the key imperatives for us in the developing countries will be consistency in reforms and also proper timing and sequencing of reforms. While we want to reform the entire civil service, most times in developing countries, and I do agree that there is the need for that, the reforms should actually cover the entire system. But I think sometimes reformists tend to want to do too much in too short a time. And this sometimes could lead to the trap of reform fatigue. So it'll be good to have like a comprehensive reform plan, but then have measures that we prioritize and sequence for effective implementation. Sometimes reforms change also based on priorities of different governments, and this often leads to discontinuities. Sometimes, for instance, here in Nigeria, we've had like ministries constantly being restructured, new ministries created, existing ones abolished, some joined, merged together. If we do have some kind of sequencing of reforms in accordance with a more global plan for the civil service, and then we sequence them appropriately, this will then help to mitigate against the rollback of reforms. Again, it will need to draw on political will to ensure that we don't have those discontinuities when, administrations in governments change. Also, reforms need to acknowledge contextual nuances, and we have this everywhere. I've just been able to pick up some, as the finance minister for Tamil Nadu spoke. There are contextual nuances in different environments, and even um, within a country, for instance, in Nigeria, there are contextual nuances at federal level and also at subnational levels. Government institutions are not always unified, in their operations and in their routines. And so these specific idiosyncrasies will need to be taken into context when designing reforms. Improving public service administration is a keen desire for most developing countries, that's for sure. However, for this to transit from just being merely aspirational, we would need reforms to take some more serious edge or tone to it. So we need our public institutions to truly, truly be resilient and to be agile. We have to recognize that one size fits does not fit all. So that one size fits all model may not apply to all developing countries. However, policy dialogues and discussions such as this webinar that we're having today helps us to gain like deeper perspectives on issues across different climes, and it also contributes to the reform process. Before I conclude, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event. I'd say again, it's a timely webinar, and I'd like to acknowledge every participant here, as well as my panelists, my fellow panelists here, and I look forward to having an interesting exchange of ideas. Thank you.